Hello, everyone. We have taken care of our technical difficulties, which for tonight's lecture is particularly challenging to ensure that we don't have technical difficulties. I'm Sarah Whitingham, otherwise known as the Dean. So let's see. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We have closed captioning available. Bing, with the QR code or the whatever that is on the screen, or you can, if you're joining us virtually, there's a little CC at the bottom of the screen. I think most people know that by now. We hope that you'll enjoy tonight's lecture, of course, and have questions afterwards. Marina will take questions afterwards. But we'll also have a Q&A tomorrow. Marina will be joined by Kate Crawford to dive deeper into this topic, which is also a nice opportunity because oftentimes you leave a lecture and you think, oh, damn, I had a really good question now when you're walking home. And so this gives you the opportunity to take advantage of your late intelligence. On March 12th, Xavier de Geter will share his recent work from XDGA, his Brussels and Paris-based architecture and urban design firm. And so for more information, please look at the website or grab one of the fabulous posters. So it gives me such great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Marina Otero Verzier, who's a lecturer here in architecture at the GSD. She's teaching a seminar entitled Depths of the Cloud, Architecture and Data Ecologies in the AI Era, as well as an open project for our MDes program entitled Storing Climates, Environmental Architectures for Information Containment. Marina is an architect and a researcher whose work sits at the intersection of critical spatial practices, ecology, technology, and activism. She was previously head of the MA of Social Design at Design Academy Eindhoven and director of research at Het Neue Instituut. She's curated exhibitions at major international venues, including the Venice Architecture Biennale, the Oslo Architecture Triennale. She's also authored a number of publications, and I won't go into her CV. That would take the entire evening. What's more important to us this evening is that Marina is a 2022 recipient of the GSD's Wheelwright Prize, an international competition for early career architects. Established in 1935, but don't worry, I'm not going to go through the entire history, in memory of Arthur Wheelwright, class of 1887, this prize was originally conceived as a travel fellowship, a sort of possibility, a ticket essentially for the Grand Tour, the European tour that architects would take. Previous recipients include Paul Rudolph, Elliot Noyes, William Worcester, and I.M. Pei, among others, so you're in illustrious company. Today's Wheelwright still involves travel, but the focus has shifted from the Grand Tour to fostering 2 years of intensive, innovative architectural research that's informed by cross-cultural engagement and can make a significant impact on architectural discourse. Recent winners have included Daniel Fernandez Pascual's project Being Shellfish and Jermaine Barnes's Anatomical Transformations in Classical Architecture. So each Wheelwright winner has to deliver a public lecture at the GSD. I encourage all of you to watch previous lectures because the whole group is pretty extraordinary and it's an amazing array. So I want to take a moment to thank the jury for the 2022 Wheelwright. As exciting as it is to crown a winner, it's actually a lot of work to evaluate the many entries and to interview and choose among the finalists. So I want to thank Will Hunter, who was a Loeb Fellow that year, and he's founder and chief executive of London School of Architecture. Adrian Lahoud, Dean of the School of Architecture at the Royal College of Art. We went heavily on the London scene that year. Mark Lee, who was chair of the Department of Architecture at that point. Irene Sunwoo, who is the chair and curator of architecture and design at the Art Institute of Chicago. And Shirley Surya, who was curator of design and architecture at M+, and I was also on that jury. So we were faced with a strong shortlist, but ultimately it was easy to select Marina, who came to us with a research project entitled Future Storage, Architectures to Host the Metaverse. a fairly, let's say, a simple idea, quite ambitious. While the term metaverse dates from the early 90s sci-fi, specifically Neil Stephenson's novel Snow Crash from 1992, so the metaverse is depicting the internet as a single, universal, immersive virtual world. The term meta was adopted as Facebook's new name just a year before Marina won the Wheelwright. So what made Marina a winner? Here's the secret. She zeroed in on a timely topic and demonstrated its urgency. As she wrote in her application, and remember this was 2022, she wrote, the footprint of data centers accounted for more than 2% of global carbon emissions, which was equivalent to the airline industries at the time. And they were expected to rise to 14% by 2040. These peopleless behemoths, which OMA's Countryside exhibition at the Guggenheim extolled as, quote, a new kind of architecture, outrageously beautiful, almost the definition of sublime in their pure forms of the grid that is at once artistic and utilitarian, are, Marina pointed out, consuming land, energy, and minerals. Her proposed project was to explore innovative ecological, circular, and egalitarian alternatives for storing data and how reimagined digital infrastructures could meet the unprecedented demands facing the world today. So remember this proposal was 2022, and it's sort of mind-boggling to think of how it's probably expanded gazillion-fold since then. So we'll hear more tonight about what directions her research took. Her talk promises to offer us speculative yet actionable directions for systems of data storage that embrace limits, decay, and transformation. I also encourage people to attend the final review later this semester of your open project, where your MDes students are continuing this research question here at the GSD. So again, let me underscore that tonight's event continues tomorrow with a lunchtime conversation between Marina and Kate Crawford, who is research professor of communications at USC's Annenberg School and recognized as a leading scholar of the social and political implications of artificial intelligence. That conversation takes place tomorrow at noon in Loeb Library. So I want to welcome you to the podium, Marina, and thank you for all that you're doing in your teaching, but also for taking this important topic further.
Well, thank you so much. Such a pleasure. I couldn't believe this was happening. So thank you so much, Sarah. Also, thank you, Kate, for being such a good ally all this time and for joining tomorrow for the conversation. All the team that make it possible, Ken, Sarah, Raquel, Matt, everyone, and to all of you. So let's see. Data centers stabilize the temperature of machines in an unstable world. There are vast technological ecosystems engineered to maintain the narrow thermal conditions in which servers and semiconductors can operate. To sustain this artificial cold, they expel heat, exhaust, and emissions into an atmosphere that is already warming. The production of data centers is not only an ever-growing volume of data. As corporations abandon previous commitments to remain competitive in the AI race, their true emissions are beginning to surface, up to 600% higher than previously recorded. At the same time, access to energy is emerging as a new frontier of conflict. As the electricity demands of data centers push power grids around the world toward its limits. The cloud is not weightless. It is a vast thermopolitical infrastructure reshaping the planet's climate. When the grid can no longer supply enough power, what was designed as a backup system, an exception, quickly becomes the rule. At the AI data center in South Haven, Mississippi, developed by Elon Musk company, highly polluting gas generators now sustain operations. What was introduced as a temporary measure has illegally become permanent, disguised as a mobile architecture on wheels. While the industry presents this data center as an exceptional case, it reveals a broader shift. As technology evolves rapidly and the lifespan of hardware grows shorter, many companies are becoming less interested in building fixed data centers. Instead, they are favoring flexible configurations that allow hardware to be replaced or relocated depending on changing conditions such as energy and water availability, tax incentives, or community responses. What could be a more telling metaphor of the lack of commitment to place and regulation than infrastructures built on wheels? This dynamic condition produces a fluid landscape in which territories become temporary hosts for compute capacity, often without long-term commitments. After all, the most important components, hardware, account for around 60% of the costs, while land and building barely 15%. And the lifespan of these components rarely exceeds 4 or 5 years. When demand shifts or priorities change, the equipment can simply be relocated elsewhere. Yet, as these infrastructures reshape power grids, water systems, and surrounding environments, once the machines move on, they leave behind indebted territories, stranded facilities, potential ruins of the AI race. What does not move is the most banal piece of architecture, the power shell, a physical structure that provides power to the site and connectivity options. It contains no critical IT infrastructure, allowing users to install their own components. The concept emerged in the late 2000s to meet the needs of enterprises seeking customization. Today, we are witnessing a renewed interest in powered shells. To keep up with rapid growth, companies are seeking faster ways to bring new capacity online. Power shells reduce development time and upfront capital requirements. They are considered a low-risk entry into the data center market, allowing companies to invest with less capital intensity, technical expertise, and long-term commitment. They also provide flexibility in a volatile industry. Northern Virginia accounts for approximately 100 of the 130 powered shells deals tracked globally. And this model is now gaining traction in other regions as well. In this context, the announcement of a new data center itself functions as a spatial instrument. Companies reserve potential access to electricity years before they know whether computation will require it. They might explore the possibility of leasing powered shells or build them. As a result, multiple sites are proposed in parallel, with the expectation that only a fraction will materialize. Infrastructure becomes probabilistic. What we see in this map is a portfolio of possible geographies rather than committed locations of data centers. In each of these regions, territory reorganized around a future that might never arrive or will last not long. That is why more and more voices, including Kate and me, are warning that we are facing a new bubble that is about to burst with catastrophic consequences. On the one hand, tech corporations and companies are spending unprecedented amounts. Global capacity could reach 200 gigabytes in 2030. AI infrastructure spending might exceed $3 trillion in 5 years, but simultaneously, 25 projects were canceled in 2025 due to local opposition. 20 projects delayed just in 1 quarter, affecting $98 billion. Major cloud companies have recalibrated expansion plans after anticipating far higher AI demand than materialized. Microsoft alone withdrew from projects representing 2 gigawatts of electricity capacity across US and Europe. The company also paused the construction of a $1 billion data center campus in Ohio. These examples reveal a crucial shift. Capital expenditure precedes necessity. The cloud is planned at continental scale, then resized after the fact. That is, the industry constantly overshoots and then corrects, at the expense of the planet, of local governments overwhelmed by paperwork, and the communities exhausted by anticipation and mobilization. How do we calm the fire at the heart of a bursting bubble? In this context in which tech corporations treat the world as their board game, calls for coordinated global opposition are important.
Going to be fighting against data centers everywhere in New Jersey. Each and every one of you again.
The increasingly volatility and lack of grounding of AI infrastructures are mirrored in the outcomes, including those shaping architectural design. Hallucinations emerge from probabilistic generation operating without sufficient constraints. Grounding anchors outputs to something beyond pattern continuation. When pattern space exceeds grounding, generation begins to float, producing more semantic material that reality can support. Yet the system does not stop, it continues. Continuation is rewarded more than restraint. In this sense, hallucination resembles a form of cognitive over-extraction, language mined beyond what this substrate can sustain. It is not simply false information, but a semantic echo of an economic system that normalizes boundless production on a finite planet. Industrial modernity is defined by similar forms of excess. Energy produced beyond ecological capacity, data generated beyond sustainable storage, expansion beyond the limits of the systems that sustain it. AI hallucination can therefore be read as a signal of infrastructural excess, mirroring an economy that cannot stop producing even when producing is detached from necessity, reality, or truth. What will an eco-social architecture of data centers look like? Certainly not a system optimized for maximal generation, but one calibrated to planetary limits. Since 2016, across institutions such as New Institute, Royal College of Art, GSAP, and particularly thanks to the Wheelwright Prize, I have advocated for redesign of data centers as ecological infrastructures. I've done so in architectural studios and seminars, in prototype design, in books, in strategic planning proposals. Today, however, as we witness a growing disregard for territorial commitment, disregard for any meaningful grounding, or for the design of the data center itself, now increasingly reduced to a little more than a shell, I have begun to question my own earlier postulates. How to enforce territorial commitment, how to plan for dismantling, how to establish global moratoriums and regulatory frameworks are becoming paramount. They compel us to think about architecture in more expanded terms. Back in 2016, most data centers were conceived largely without the involvement of architects, except perhaps to design the facade, office spaces, or the floor plan. Yet popular and governmental backlash against these infrastructures triggered sometimes idiosyncratic architectural responses around the world aimed at making them more publicly acceptable. Vertical, iconic, futuristic projects, proposal for programmatic hybridization, vernacular approaches, and a range of green solutions. Meanwhile, in schools of architecture around the world and in some global engineer and architectural firms, data centers were imagined as central elements of urban development, with city life even revolving around their needs. In doing so, despite good intentions, we often overlooked and even reward the industry growing disregard for the common ground and the common good, the very terrain where architecture is supposed to operate. I have also fall in the trap. And I will now go through some of my attempts over the past years to redesign data centers, advocate for the regulation, and contribute to the definition of legal frameworks. They are all incomplete, even failed, but I hope still generative forms of engagement. This is Atlas, one of the two supercomputers at the Donostia International Physics Center in the Basque Country. Atlas is used by the scientific community to, for example, run simulations of the universe origins, like this one. Or perhaps a bit more easy, this one. But for Atlas to generate these images, this has to be done. The machine consumes significant amounts of energy and water and emits CO2 as well as substantial heat. This heat must be carefully managed to avoid disruption. In this facility, the heat is expelled outdoors through large fans. The air release can reach temperatures of around 50 degrees Celsius, about 122 Fahrenheit, I think. The supercomputing center redirects the heat into the immediate environment, that is a park, so you can see the wall behind which Atlas is and the fans out there. This process has caused, for example, a loquat tree to bear fruit earlier than usual in the year. The tree seems confused, thinks it's in another season. Understood on a planetary scale, this particular case reveals the significant impact that digital infrastructures can have on processes related to climate change. Heat is a byproduct of computation, the residue of vast amounts of electricity used to cool servers, often at the expense of the planet. Rather than treating it as waste, operators increasingly reframe heat as a product, a commodity, supported by carefully staged PR campaigns, such as the one surrounding the Paris Olympics, where a data center was used to heat a swimming pool. Julia Belkova calls this alignment of bodies, buildings, data, and energy into a single governing system the thermopolitics of data.
Water polo players are playing in a heated pool, and a Bay Area tech company is a big reason why. Our business and tech reporter, Scott Budman, flips the switch.
Data centers like this are full of technology that powers software and hardware used by companies, even cities. As you can also imagine, they create a lot of heat and energy that, in the case of a Bay Area company, is being used to help power the Olympic Games.
Okay. Since 2022, and with the support of the Wheelwright Prize, I have conducted fieldwork to identify alternative models and have been involved in advocacy, regulation, and design processes around data centers. One of my early focal points and a source of inspiration for new models was Sweden, which I have visited regularly to study emerging approaches to the future of data centers. I visited several times Sweden and different sites, including the ICE data center in Luleå, where waste heat from their data centers is used to support local heating and even grow plants and vegetables. Our conversations with ChatGPT could grow tomatoes. They also repurpose waste heat to grow worms, fish in fish farms, or dry wood that is later used as biomass. Worms proved to be the most successful of the three applications. They are fed to chickens, which otherwise will rely on imported feed made by soy grown in the Amazon, contributing to deforestation. The chickens are apparently very happy, and the process contributes to a circular economy in the region. Our digital files generate heat, the heat generates worms, the worms feed the chickens, and the humans eat the chickens, only to keep producing more AI-generated videos. In Stockholm, part of the energy generated by the servers is transferred to the city's heating network. Hallucinations could also heat homes. In fact, Carnot, a French company, installs its heating servers in homes, offering residents a free source of heat. According to them, a server can heat a room. The problem arises in summer. Who wants extra warmth during a heat wave? That is why they now use small data centers to provide apartment buildings with warm water, which is used year-round. Still, Why should a city adapt to data centers, consuming their waste, instead of pursuing less energy-intensive solutions? If a city depends on computation for heating, who governs daily life? The municipality, the platform? What forms of dependence emerge when comfort depends on data production? Is recycling waste heat truly ecological, or does it legitimize even more computation? And will you accept your home being heated by financial calculations or AI training? In these examples, data production becomes necessarily for everyday life, creating dependencies. Heating now depends on computation. Let's not forget that data centers are sites of struggle, opaque infrastructures that extract our data and collective intelligence to generate billions, capturing our attention, time, and money, only to sell us products we never needed in the first place, or to sell us their waste. 100 megabytes data center consume as much electricity as 100,000 households. Data centers require more and more megabytes. The largest data centers announced consume more than 3 million households, more than entire cities. This means that in many cities, it is not possible to build new homes because they will not have access to electricity. The grid is already stretched by data center consumption, which means we have to make decisions, have priorities. Instead of reducing operation, the industry seeks techno-fixes to lower the energy required for cooling. Floating data centers, such as Nautilus in Stockton, California, use surrounding water to cool their servers, potentially endangering species that become trapped in their filtration systems. Another proposal is underwater data centers, cooled directly by seawater, though their impact on marine ecologies remains to be seen. Outer space is not spared. Several proposals imagine data centers orbiting the Earth, powered by the sun. They also use the cold of space to temper the heat of our desires, our compulsive desires for ever more data and energy. This is one of the companies that has created a project for data centers in space for the European Union, Thales Alenia. These compulsive desires for even more energy also manifest in digging deep into the ground. To power our technological dreams, we mine the earth for materials such as lithium, used in batteries, electric vehicles, and data centers, as well as for elements that enable semiconductors, transistors, and digital storage. The cloud does not float above the ground. It is built into these depths. Our compulsion to create digital worlds destroys this imperfect world we inhabit. But our desires sometimes burst. Across the internet, thousands of videos document lithium battery explosions in mobile phones, portable hard drives, scooters, electric bicycles, a mobile battery system used in data centers by people like Elon Musk. When pushed beyond their limits, these devices release the heat stored inside them, small flashes of a larger system driven by an endless demand of energy, data, and speed. Each blast becomes a haunting metaphor for the flammable and unstable nature of the very society these technologies sustain, a reminder of the volatility of the industry and of these intertwined forms of power, both political and electrical. I often imagine the ecosystem displaced by blasting and excavating those giant mines, erupting in solidarity with social uprisings. These protests, human and more than human alike, expose the deep violence of market-driven economies of desire and associated unsustainable lifestyles, particularly in the global north. This and other unexpected disruption destabilized the virtuous circles that promised to resolve the excess of the data center industry, giving rise to what I call feral proliferations, borrowing from Anat Singh. This is the Genesis Digital Assets Greenhouse Project, a crypto mining facility in Boden, north of Sweden, that decided to make something grow out of its excess. As servers continuously perform cryptographic calculations in the warehouse, they produce heat as a byproduct, which is redirected into the greenhouse. The excess energy is captured in the greenhouse, where rows of plants attempt to make life out of computation. The air from the server rooms, however, turned out to be too dry, perfect for machines, but disastrous for plants. They will not survive without a kind of atmospheric mediation. When I visited the site for the first time, they had newly installed humidifiers, releasing fine sprays at intervals. 2 years later, I returned, this time with architecture students from Paris. We learned that the water carefully added to correct the dryness had its own consequences on the plants. Moisture invited other forms of life into the greenhouse. Bugs, insects arrived, first unnoticed, then everywhere, devouring the plants. The humidity, the very condition that made vegetable life possible, also opened the door for its destruction and revealed this seemingly controlled environment as porous, entangled with ecologies that do not follow project timelines. Now the soil beds are gone. In the place are rows of hydroponic systems, pipes, trays, nutrient solutions circulating in closed loops, more manageable. With life further abstracted, the greenhouse looks less like a garden and more like an extension of the server logic next door. The prototype promised the elegance of the loop. Heat that would otherwise be wasted becomes a resource. Yet each solution produces new imbalances, a new externality. Each attempt to align digital and biological metabolisms reveals frictions that cannot be fully engineered away. The experimental Boden greenhouse had become a laboratory of the unintended consequences, where climate, code, insects, and plants negotiate terms that exceed the original design. Among server racks, lettuce, roots, and the specter of new bugs, a question lingers. What does it mean to grow life in the exhaust of computation? And who or what gets to thrive in the current digital ecosystem? I really don't know if this is AI, but I love the kittens. It is precisely in these failed experiments, accidents, and unexpected feral proliferations that other more than human digital futures begin to emerge. Bugs, cats, and even those jellyfish that managed to disrupt the dream of data centers powered by nuclear energy. Let's return to the loqua tree blooming in the excess heat of a supercomputer. Together with the scientists at the Donostia International Physics Center and the team from Tabacalera, we designed a prototype computational compost, a project that examines the environmental impact of data storage and proposes a synergy between technology and ecology. It consists of a prototype that uses the heat emitted by computers, in this case, a Raspberry Pi farm, running simulations of the origin of the universe. Each computer reaches temperatures of about 70 degrees Celsius, and this excess heat is redistributed and transferred to the other side of the prototype. This heat transforms around 24 degrees Celsius and feeds a vermicomposting system with live worms and microorganisms that use this energy to produce fertile soil, soil that sustains life in its most primordial form. The resulting compost becomes vibrant material emergments that transcend utilitarian motivations and exceed human intentions. And the worms this time are not fed to chickens. Celestial and biological bodies are connected through processes of metabolism and fermentation, decomposition and regeneration, the metamorphosis that runs through every cycle of matter. However, I too unintentionally fall into the promise of virtuous cycles of waste reuse. And as previous examples, our desires were met with feral proliferations. A new species, one that had not been invited to the prototype, appeared. It was not a worm, but we didn't know what it was. It took us some time, and it was named Oxidus gracilis, probably came with the soil. We were promised the presence was a sign of very healthy compost and that they will get along with the worms, although I didn't look like that. It seemed more like a battlefield. But I was also told that, death is part of life and composting. A few days later, I received this message from the exhibition designer. Oxidus gracilis had refused to be part of the loop. While energy consumption and waste heat management is a significant challenge for data centers, so too is the immense amount of water used to cool the servers. This is the cloud, this is the real cloud, heavy, hungry, polluting, and formed by the evaporation of millions of liters of water used to cool servers, while simultaneously warming the surrounding environment. I have worked in Chile alongside local communities in Quilicura, in the outskirts of Santiago, protesting data centers like this one by Google. In its quest to cool down servers, the system dries up this wetland ecosystem. The residents of Quilicura are denouncing the effects of data centers on the local ecosystem. Rodrigo Vallejos, a community representative, explains that data centers are causing increasingly ecosocial fragility for the local human and more than human populations. Meanwhile, companies and governments keep on looking for less harmful innovations or remediations. This is the Urban Forest Quilicura, a mass reforestation project by Google to offset the carbon emissions produced during the construction of its data center. Yet, as you can see, the trees are struggling to survive without the lack of water and funding for its maintenance. That's why the population of Quilicura, like many communities around the world, has been inspired and vindicated by the community of Cerrillos, also in Santiago, which successfully opposed a Google data center that would have contributed to the overexploitation of a local aquifer in a context of drought. As a result of these trips conducted during the Wheelwright research, I ended up working with these local groups on activism, advocacy, and advancing forms of regulation. We collaborated in drafting the first national plan for data centers in Chile, an initiative of the Ministry of Science. This experience also encouraged many of us, researchers, activists, to pursue regulatory initiatives in other regions. In Europe, for example, current regulations mandate optimizing energy consumption and utilizing waste heat. However, as I have argued today, this is not enough, and such soft measures can distract from the real environmental cost of AI. Calls for a moratorium on the construction of data centers are also growing worldwide, including in the United States, where an increasing number of moratorium bills have recently been introduced. As you can see all of them there. Wisconsin, Virginia, Vermont, South Carolina. Meanwhile, until these bills materialize, I organize sessions in several architectural organizations to encourage a more critical approach to the design of data centers, rather than adopting a servile, accommodating position towards the industry. I'm contributing to advisory work for municipalities in Spain facing a rapid boom of data centers. Small towns in Aragon, like this one, are overwhelmed by the arrival of all these data centers, drawn by regulatory frameworks designed by the regional government to attract these corporations, lowering taxes, accelerating permitting, and converting land to accommodate new infrastructures. Without proper scrutiny of their effects on the territory, municipalities are left to confront an overwhelming situation, facing multiple projects proposed by some of the most powerful corporations in the world, whose teams far exceed the capacity of local administrations. This imbalance collapses municipal systems and prevents them from carrying out their daily tasks or advancing their own projects for the community, especially if they choose to resist these developments. After all, The projected data centers are larger than the town itself, and this is only one of at least 3 projects in the region attracted by the lax regulatory framework. I advise these municipalities, sitting with them at the negotiation table, opposite to the corporations, and reviewing their documents with the support of other colleagues. Together, we are also taking legal action against the regulatory framework that allows these corporations to take over. We are currently involved in an unprecedented lawsuit against Amazon, and you can still donate to support the legal efforts behind these actions. And of course, public protests are also taking place in Spain. The first national demonstration against data centers was held just a few months ago. The protests are happening everywhere globally, and the groups share strategies against an industry that overpowers governments. In addition to prototypes, legislation, and advisory work, I'm also interested in exploring speculative yet actionable, let's hope, directions for systemic data storage change. Systems that embrace limit, decay, and transformation. I draw on sovereign and indigenous clouds, feminist servers, permacomputing, solarpunk imaginaries, and low-tech computation. Let's return to the notion of excess. For years, I've been haunted by the Gartner study titled, "How Much is Not Enough?" Humans and artificial intelligences are amassing data at a rate that will surpass our storage and processing capabilities. This graph, Gartner refers to as zone of potential insufficiency, estimating that data production will exceed the scalability of existing data storage solutions. The study predates the current AI craze, yet is a warning and even more relevant today. One response to that graph could be to build more data centers. We already know where that leads: more extraction, more energy demand, and deeper planetary strain. But what if the question is not how to store everything, but how to live with limits? What if the data infrastructures were designed not for endless accumulation, but for embodied memory, decay, and transformation? During my research, I visited industries that generate the largest amounts of data beyond AI training, such as astronomical observatories or scientific laboratories. Chile concentrates around 40% of the world astronomical observation infrastructure and is expected to reach 70% within this decade. And I visited some of these sites, such as Cerro Tololo or Vera Rubin, the latest and most powerful so far. By extracting from the sky, these astronomical observatories generate data in unprecedented volumes that no single facility can store, making artificial intelligence necessary to filter the information and process it. The rest, what is not relevant, is simply discarded. So it's kind of like tap water flowing continuously with data. These sites also encroach on indigenous lands, impact the environments, and dominate the views of the surrounding mountain summits. These are significant for indigenous people and are deeply embedded in Andean ontologies. Atop the Andes, control over territory parallels the dominance of indigenous knowledge. In this context is when I became also obsessed with alternative forms of storage of information, and in particular, this quipu. It's the largest on display at the Museo Chileno de Arte Precolombino in Santiago, in Chile. This quipu represents one of the systems for recording information used by the Inca. A state official, or quipu camayocs, made these devices to record census data, tributes, genealogies, and even poems. Each string is capable of reflecting millions of different combinations of color, fiber, and note direction to record an enormous range of information and knowledge. Together, these sequences construct a coded system whose mathematical organization anticipates the operations of a computer. Quipus were mostly illegible to the Spanish colonizers. After instances when quipus were used to organize uprisings against colonial rule by carrying encrypted messages, quipus were prohibited. Not many survived. Their transcriptions were not preserved alongside the quipus or their illustrations, which makes the relationship between the notes and their meanings undecipherable. Paradoxically, today digital infrastructure is considered key to deciphering the quipus. Advances in AI and other digital tools are presented as instruments capable of revealing their secrets. Digitized quipus now constitute a de facto database mined by algorithms. Their work is useless. What was destroyed by colonization was not only the knowledge to code and decode quipus, but the situated social, ecological, cultural relations organized around them, leaving the surviving courts as evidence of the violence of erasure deployed by colonialism. In this context, instead of data extraction, groundless excess, hallucination, I advocate for a practice of collective mourning, data mourning. Mourning as a practice of remembrance that recognizes that collective memory is more than its storage in the cloud. After all, despite promises of endless accumulation and storage, data decays. Ask these users of Google Photos who found that some of their images stored in 2014-15 were unreadable, or had glitches. Data decays just as our bodies and the planet do, yet we keep relying on externalized devices in a futile attempt to contain the past, the present, and future within climate-controlled spaces, places where we hope that documents, objects, and information can withstand the warming air, the shifting seasons, even time itself, places like museums, archives, and data centers. During the fieldwork in Australia, I was made familiar with the story of Mungo Man and Mungo Lady. Among the oldest known human remains in Australia, they were taken from country by scientists in the 20th century, separating them from the Aboriginal communities to whom they belonged, and preserved in a climatized space in a museum. After decades of advocacy by traditional owners, their remains were finally returned to country and reburied, composted, restoring them to their ancestral land. These episodes help us ask, what is the best way to preserve memories? What should be stored and for whom? These questions are also at the core of my work in Tuvalu as part of the GSAP Data Mourning Clinic. Tuvalu faces the possibility of becoming the first nation to lose its sovereignty to climate change. Its digital twin has emerged as a viable alternative to the analog one. Here, the notion of data mourning takes on new implications, as indigenous knowledge is currently being transformed into data sets and combined with data from sensing technologies populating the island. What kinds of feral proliferations might emerge in digital Tuvalu? I'm also inspired by the beautiful passage by Marisol de la Cadena in her book, Earth Beings, where Mariano's son burns important historical documents to make tea for his guest. Countering the thermopolitics of preservation and storage, the gesture embraces letting go as a form of care and solidarity. Are we ready to let it go?
Is fire. From Ireland to Finland to Spain to Greece, bonfires were often lit on St. John's Eve at sunset and kept throughout the night into early midsummer morning.
In addition to the notion of data mourning, I'm also working towards what I call ecologies of data. A different paradigm emerges when data is understood through distinct ecologies: hot, warm, cold, open, private, ephemeral, and long-lasting. Different ecologies imply different ways of storing information and different levels of security, more appropriate than the systems we use today, which assume that all data must remain hot and highly secured. Some data does not need this intensity. Cold or long-term data, for example, might not require the security of immediacy of a Tier 4 facility, or could be stored in environments designed for slower rhythms of access. By aligning the design and location of infrastructure with the nature and sensitivity of different types of data, we could move forward context-specific systems rather than defaulting to maximum intensity or relying on powered shells. Through this lens, we can imagine alternative forms of computation, such as the Compost computer, developed by Future Everything and the University of Arts in London. We can also think of community-driven, decentralized microdata centers that could be managed at the individual or neighborhood level. infrastructures that are, for example, solar-powered, and therefore sometimes go offline, or are simply slow. Or they search for servers located somewhere in the world where the sun is shining, as imagined by Tegabrain in Solar Protocol. This also leads to practical priorities. Today, digital infrastructure is designed as if society were always on, always demanding, always urgent. The system makes us always on, always demanding, always urgent, but cities are not like that. Urban life moves in rhythms. There are peaks and lulls, weekdays and weekends, seasons, work hours, sleep cycles, periods of energy abundance, energy scarcity. Only certain services truly require uninterrupted operation, such as hospital or emergency systems. Much of the rest do not. We should ask which types of compute are truly critical and must be on, designed for workload, flexibility, and load shifting. Integrate large-scale storage with media that require less energy, and connect these choices to community governance. By distinguishing types of compute, we can design infrastructure proportionate to necessity. We can also reshape expectations around latency. The demand for instantaneous responses inflates infrastructure. If every query must be returned in 3 seconds, system must be provisioned for extreme peaks. But if some devices allow delay, lower resolution, asynchronous operation, the instantaneous power requirement drops. This means introducing temporal awareness into digital consumption. A cyclic model could be embedded within community agreements that link compute intensity to local energy conditions, water availability, or seasonal constraints. Infrastructure will become responsive to place rather than imposed upon it. This is the basis of a new public contract grounded in public infrastructure and co-stewardship. Cities already operate this way. Digital infrastructure could mirror these circadian patterns instead of overreading them. A few months ago, I asked students from the TH in Zurich, Department of Architecture, led by Professor Milica Topalovic, to think about these other digital rhythms, to think of their own cloud. They didn't imagine powered shells. Some of them traced their current dependency of digital infrastructure and were quite shocked. Others experimented with what they call fasting data consumption, or digital fasting. They imagine their digital usage associated to circadian rhythms, proposed seasonal servers, or servers animated only by wind. They also explore what it will mean to prioritize their menstrual rhythms over those of the digital platforms imposed on their bodies. I want to finish by thanking these students and all the students and amazing allies like Kate who have walked with me along the way. I feel optimistic and grateful. Today, I want to celebrate all of them. Celebrate the bugs, the cats, the jellyfish, the Oxidus gracilis, the activist groups, and all the feral proliferations that rise up and revolt against these deadly data-driven energy cultures, their thermopolitics, and their regimes of excess. Thank you. And this is everyone who has contributed to all this work, and there are more, so it's by far not a single effort. Well, it was a ride. I don't know if anyone has any question. I will be happy to try to respond. Sorry.
That was a real pleasure and a little bit alarming to watch. So you have two strains of approach. One is looking at the data centers, and you say that there's failure in the idea of actually making them ecologically possible. You talk about your own failures, and you demonstrate with some of the more amusing parts of the talk other failures. And then the other seems to be, changing behaviors, or you don't have regulation in between, but there's a suggestion of it with the work you're doing with the UN and with Chile and different countries. I guess I sort of want to go at each one of these categories, and the failures, I mean, there are iterations. The Bowdoin examples, I think, fascinated me in terms of, the sad scene of the lack of plants and then putting in the humidifiers and the bugs. Do you think really that there isn't a possibility for iterations that could succeed in creating a circular system that would at least allow for some form of growth or gardening, farming, that would possibly work? Or do you think that it will always have some sort of feral component that will ruin the system? So that's one end. And then at the other end is the pedagogical one. I was intrigued by the Zurich examples, and to what extent can approaching data differently pedagogically, so this was in my mind throughout, and then you answered it somewhat with the Zurich example, but I wondered if you could elaborate on that end as well.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sarah. To me, there are different temporalities and urgencies. So on the one hand, I think regulation, advocacy, activism, advisory work is fundamental to tackle what happens right now. And this is, we have to do something, regardless of what I think about the current models, which is clear by the talk. But we have to try to figure it out, what is going on, and try to control it a little bit, or as much as possible. At the same time, I'm interested in seeking other possibilities. And it's not that, I think I celebrate the failure. It's not in a romantic way, but just to say that the fallacy of the system, what the system proposes, at this idea of progress, at this idea of the virtuous loop, I think that's the problem. It's not that I think it's okay to count on the bugs and the feral proliferations. I think actually these more porous systems, more open-ended, is what we should aim for. But the system, on the one hand, pretends that failure is not happening. So all the data centers are designed particularly to be operating 24/7, regardless of war, climate change, you name it. But it's a fallacy as well. We know that diesel generators that supposedly are kind of exceptional for exceptional circumstances end up being the rule. So what I try to understand is that to kind of denaturalize the failure as something that happens, because even in the AI, in our interactions with ChatGPT, in our hallucinations, failure is part of the system. What I criticize is this attempt to conceal it. So in a way, how to design systems that can integrate these proliferations in a way that are, part of what we expect, that is not trying to create these Cartesian enclosures, but something that is more responsive.
Exhibitions that highlight bugs and worms.
The worms, I was taken from here and there, so I was fascinated by the worms in Sweden, but I felt bad for the worms that were fed to chickens, so I wanted to do something with the worms. And after the exhibition, they go somewhere and they are taken care, and otherwise they escape, as we have seen. And then the other question is the tendency of architecture to try to also close the loop. And we see many instances where we try to say, okay, there is this waste heat, let's do something with it. And it's like, well, this is the waste. It's already, the problem is already happened because it's consuming electricity and water. So we're just left with the waste of these industries, and we are supposed to design cities around them. And I'm like, well, I don't think that's what we should do. I think data centers should respond to the real needs of cities and not the other way around. That is what I'm seeing more and more, like big architectural offices designing cities around data centers. I think if the data centers will not be these massive corporations that, that are challenging our democracies, maybe, but I don't think that's fair. The question of pedagogy, I think, has been fundamental to test ideas. And the Zurich exercise was an invitation, and I was very pleased to see these ideas because, again, it allows students to think about the relation with data differently. So I think it was generative. And what we are doing at the GSD now with both the courses I'm teaching, but in particular one that is this seminar that we look at the tools we use. So say, okay, we are part of this ecosystem. We are using ChatGPT, we are using image generation, we are using Pinterest, we are using Rhino, we are using all these systems, and many times we are just end users. We don't have agency on the tools that define the architecture we design. So the entire course is around understanding each student look at one of those tools. We understand this genealogy, so many times they have histories, they don't come out of the blue. The genealogies, and we unpack them and try to see what type of agency we have, if we can repurpose them so it serves other interests and not the interest of those who just designed them. So it's a fun, and again, we don't know. We are trying, but I think it's fundamental to introduce this awareness within the schools of architecture and to talk about speed and resolution and to think about our relation with data and the labor that is many times concealed behind all these tools and the environmental impact. So yeah, to me, that's is at the core of what we try to do.
Thank you.
I think there is one question too.
Hi, Marina. Thank you so much. My question is similar to Sarah's. Actually, I think you have this designer role of all these experiments of design strategies about data centers. But you also have this advisory role to all those national and regional regulations. I'm curious to hear, what do you think is required of the regulation side? Maybe particularly from the planning regulation side, because I think there are a lot of planners in the room, to kind of ensure or promote those design strategies to become realistic in our cities.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's a great question. Well, I think there are these different hats require also to me to, reposition, realign myself every time, because when I'm advising a municipality, I have to also understand that I'm there to support their interests, and their interests might not be my interest. They might not want to do, deal with worms and, bugs and cats. So I have to find what my voice is as a mediator of the desires of these municipalities. And sometimes they might want to negotiate with the companies because these companies don't pay taxes and they are overwhelming their infrastructures, so they might want to have a better deal. Sometimes they don't want them in the territory, so there are many different responses. So that advisory work is really supportive, a supportive role, and try to be a spokesperson for teams that are small and they don't have perhaps the expertise on data centers to sit down in front of 20 people from one of these companies. But at the same time, we have to look into the regulations that in the first place allow these data centers to be installed. That's what we are doing. We're challenging that regulation, in particular in Spain, with this legal court case. And what we think is that there hasn't been enough planning so far. Since I started looking into data centers back in 2015, when I was at the New Institute in the Netherlands, we saw how actually these companies were bending the system to their will. So they will make exceptions. Most of the countries will make exceptions for these companies to be installed in their territories. So there were, even that there will be a legislation in place, even there will be planning, it doesn't matter. They kind of change the uses of the land. They just make every type of exception for them. So this is how it started to grow, and these companies got used to it. And now it's growing at a speed that this is unsustainable. It was already there, but now it's even more. So what we are looking for is the forms of legislation that involve strategic planning. That's what we try to do in Chile, to say, well, Chile wants data centers, but they also know that they might not have enough resources for all the applications for data centers that are being, receiving. So they have to know how many data centers they want to have and where. So part of the idea is to create that strategic planning at the level of the country. Second, data centers many times think that, if these regulations are loose, they will be faster in developing their businesses. But sometimes it's not the case because they lack legitimacy. So many of these regulations involve collaboration with local communities to understand if there is any will or any kind of form of agreement between this type of infrastructures and those who will host them. So there are many layers of participation and negotiation and, strategic planning at the level of country. But the problem is that, as you have seen in the map, these global companies are operating globally and just betting and having different proposals in different places at the same time. So if one becomes too complicated, they withdraw the project and go elsewhere. So that's why more and more we think that what is needed exceeds the municipal level or the regional level, even exceeds the national level, because it's not how these companies operate. So we need something bigger, and that's the challenge. There are more ideas for global moratoriums. There are UN calling for moratoriums, so there are transnational institutions. Still is not enough. But the idea will be that we can create alliances, and for instance in Europe, that will not be so far-fetched, to try to understand how to plan this infrastructure at the level of the continent, or at least the European Union. So these are the conversations that are happening now, but it ranges. It's very context-specific, even though that we have to look at the very contextual situations and the large scale because they operate in both.
Thank you so much.
Oof.
Hey, yeah. I think my gut feeling about this whole thing is that it feels kind of backwards, right? You're saying all these data centers impose some negative externalities to your communities and stuff, but the countries from the top down are still giving you tax breaks, they're giving you incentives, they're letting you override whatever legislation that exists. And that feels like a very it feels similar to tax havens, where there's some adverse incentives. And I'm curious about what you think about the right way to align those incentives are at the top level and the grassroots level.
This kind of, the countries are most of the time under pressure because these companies say if you don't support our projects in your country, we go to your neighbor. No, that's always the case. So this is difficult for governments, although it becomes less difficult recently. I think they are seeing how communities are really protesting because grids are overstretched and governments have to invest heavily on these infrastructures. Even Donald Trump is telling these companies to pay for part of the infrastructure. So imagine what is going on because energy prices in these places, in Ireland, in many other places in different regions in the US are also growing because of this, what the works that have to be done in the infrastructure. So in addition to water scarcity, all the problems with infrastructure, the rising bills and electric bills, so there are many things brewing. And that is forcing some of the governments to try to regulate. That's not easy when you negotiate with these companies. And at the same time, because the level of investment that these companies have made over the last decades is unprecedented. Most countries don't have even the capacity to make such a new strategy from one day to another. So it requires serious planning. So it's this dance between, on the one hand, wanting to regulate, on the other, feel that, also again, that overwhelming feeling. I'm not, any kind of president of any country, so luckily I can offer advice in different ways, but I know that for a fact that these conversations are happening in many different places, and there are different strategies that you can see. But my guess is that we will see more moratorium, and we will also see more regulation. And many people even from the point of view of the industry, they agree that these fast-track processes actually backlash many times. And without proper legitimacy, these projects most of the times fail. So there's the kind of other type of agreements that have to be in place.
That makes sense.
Thank you for the amazing lecture. My question is towards the end of your lecture. You were talking about sort of deleting data or being mindful or categorizing them in such a way that it's not always on demand. My question is, it was sort of posed as a more speculative at the moment in my perspective. Where do you see it happening? That is a question. And one anecdote that I want to add to think about this situation is earlier video cassette, when it was invented, it was meant to be ephemeral almost because it was so expensive. So every broadcasting station was always rewriting on the same medium because it was so expensive. And I wonder, do you see some similar things happening in current sort of data storage field?
Yeah, but like when you delete something from a computer, you don't necessarily, it doesn't disappear, you overwrite it as well. So this is part of how the system works. But I mean, I'm still interested in those notions. I grew a bit disenchanted, but I still hold on to them because they allow me to think, not only in like the here and now, not only in the urgent questions, but also to project into the future. I think more and more these kind of ideas about different loads, different temporalities, that's totally possible. I've discussed with many people working in AI and compute, and it's not something strange. It's just like data centers tend to maximize their benefits, and that means having these facilities as they have it 24/7. But it's not that all data needs be treated in that way. So it definitely it's already been done. So for instance, AI training has different rhythms that, the way in which we use data, hot data for our operations to check, the bank, whatever. So it's already computational loads vary. So I think that's totally possible. It's just a question of how the market see profit. And perhaps if infrastructures will not purely private, then other values will be at play that will allow us to consider other variables and not necessarily, design for highly private, hot data and maximum profit. And the reason also I think I'm a bit naive is when I started working on these questions of mourning, I went, thanks to the Wheelwright, I took a trip to see the director of research at a major corporation in Palo Alto. And it was interesting. The person offered me 10 minutes and we ended up having an hour conversation, so clearly was interested. But when I said, why when we receive an email, it doesn't disappear maybe after 3 days unless we marked as important? Why things stay? It's like, well, that's a beautiful idea, but we are in the business of data. We want to accumulate data, and actually we are more interested in compressing information than in deleting information. It was years ago, so I imagine that this person was referring to big data, but obviously it's also AI training and many other questions. So that's what I still hold on to this idea, although I know that is almost an impossibility, but impossibility that I find productive, because even if I think that we have to let go, it's also reivindicating other forms of memory, other forms of relating to information, other forms of ideas of preservation that might not require this technological apparatus. But at the same time, it's also the idea that in many ways, we need other type of understanding of our own fragility. And again, this idea that the systems that are not always virtual circles, but something else happen. But I know it's an impossibility because when I've also checked, and you know that, most of the information, even we want to delete it, even if you throw it to the garbage can, trash can, doesn't disappear. So there are many websites that once you have an interaction with them, data stays. So you can go to this website called Just Delete Me, and you will see, like, from Wikipedia to YouTube to many others. So I hold on to that as something that allows me to think, but in a way it's also an impossibility.
Hi, thank you for this conversation. I have a question, and I missed a good chunk of the thing, but caught when you were talking about basically the mediation efforts and the failures of them. It seems as though they were primarily focusing on the heat output. I'm wondering, have there been efforts for the air pollution specifically to kind of try and mitigate that? Because it's like the generation of these things it's causing more than one problem. The same way you said, the mediation is introducing more issues. So I was wondering if there were any efforts in regards to that.
Yeah, so obviously there are different battlegrounds. No? One is energy consumption, the other is water, then the other is the excess heat, the other is emissions, both pollution but also sound, for instance, sound pollution, heat islands that are created by data centers. And the problem is that when you try to tackle one, maybe the other gets even worse. So for instance, and I say we, many of us put so much emphasis on the question of water that now the industry has moved to create almost like trademark, dry cooling, zero water cooling, all these systems that are already, PR campaign. I don't have time to tell you that most of them are actually not zero water. They use water, nevertheless. But actually, if you lower the use of water, most of the times, and this is explained by these companies in the meetings I have, you need to use more energy. So that's always, If you use more water, you can maybe use less energy, but it's always something that you use. And then there is always some sort of emissions. In the case, obviously, there are filters that you can use. It depends on the type of cooling system. It really depends. But the problem is that, as I said in the lecture many times, the systems that are supposed to be operating just in very particular moments are actually not. For instance, the diesel generators that Elon Musk uses. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but for his part, because it's real. But these generators are used more often than we think, because in order to know that they are going to work when you have a catastrophe or you have a problem, a failure, you have to test them. So at least a few times a month, or you have to turn them on. So these things, most of the times, are not written in the environmental reports. And so, yeah, it's summatory of things. It's many, many questions. But they try to deal with sound, for instance, with using some, silencing devices. They try to filter the pollution. But it's so much. The scale is so vast that the effects are also vast. And the problem is that most of these regions don't only host one, they have several of them. So you can imagine at certain moments, 250 generators of this data center, another of this one, another of this one, another of this one, emitting CO2 and noise is wild. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I want to remind everyone that we have, is this working? Yeah. That we have tomorrow to continue the conversation. But I'm intrigued by just listening to you answer the questions, because you're essentially saying, yeah, this is hopeless, and you say it with a smile, and you say, and like the world is going to shit, but you say it with a smile. But what impresses me is that you are operating as a professor, as someone entering policy discussions, someone challenging Amazon, someone working on actual design. So you're essentially saying, okay, yeah, this is a shit show, frankly, but I'm going to engage it with every means that I have at my disposal as an architect, And those means are an incredible variety. And somehow I'm just going to keep going at this on all of these levels. And I admire that, because I think that that's the only way we can actually engage these massive problems and start to chip away at them in a way that I believe will lead to something. And so, whether you can actually convince people to let data disappear, or whether you will design something where the worms have a happy life, I have faith that you're going to lead us to a better world. And so I want to thank you for what you gave us in terms of some optimism tonight.
Thank you.
And remind
Thank you.
everyone, tomorrow at noon in Loeb Library. Thank you.
Thank you.